From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. We've been covering a lot of big, important issues as we've advanced through this series, but today is a episode that focuses on giants. The giant issue of the time, politically, was the sales tax of that period. And so we're going to focus in on the sales tax, along with other items related to our special guest, who also was a giant. Jim Lucas was one of the governmental and political giants of the period, and we're so pleased to be able to have him on here. Jim was Speaker of the House in 1969 and 1971, a critical time frame in the crucible of change. Prior to that, he'd been Majority Leader in 67, Minority Leader in 65. He was elected 6 times to the legislature. I think I can say that were it not for the sales tax, he probably would have been governor of Montana, a highly respected and still highly respected person, a citizen of Montana, and a former Speaker of the House. And Jim, we couldn't be more pleased than to have you join us to discuss this important period and these important issues. You've been practicing law for a long time, but boy, when you were in the middle of things, you were one of the driving forces in Montana politics and government during that period. And it was a terrific period of change, and I know you've had some time to think about what was it that facilitated and brought about this kind of change. And as someone who was right in the middle of it, I was just a young guy coming up at the edges of this thing. You were right in the heart of it. How did you see the period in terms of the movement toward change that was occurring at that time?
Evan, before I get into answering that question, I want to first thank you and thank also the person, Ellis Waldron, who put together the Atlas of Montana elections, because without your knowledge and his printed books and others to say the same, I probably would have a very difficult time in remembering 50 and 60 years ago. My wife claims I can't remember beyond yesterday, but regardless, and if I had to do this, create this program, I would do one change, and that is I would make you the responder and I would be the interviewer, because you have that great background.
Well, thank you. But
Evan, of course, is the director of the community and community outreach for Highland College, part of Montana Tech. And he also has made great strides through the years representing the Democrat Party, much of the time nationally, much of the time in behalf of governors. Just great. I've told him that he is to be admired because he's done such a great job, and if he continues in this path, the Republican Party may still consider having you come across to that.
My grandmother is watching me carefully.
Well, let me talk for a minute about the changes. In the 1960s, these were turbulent times in the Montana legislature, and today we're going to talk about the period mostly from 1960 to 1975. And of course, the great thing during those times was the sales tax and what it did in Montana politics. When the Constitution was written in 1989, Montana was a rural state, but by 1960, the census showed we had become urban. There were obviously unequal representation at that time, in that the cities, larger cities, could outvote the rural people considerably. In fact, one time the vote could be 49-7, with the 7 being the farmer-rancher people. The question of the mounting concern about the adequacy of the Constitution of Montana, whether it still filled the bill. The question of mandated legislative reapportionment, and the United States Supreme Court mandating legislative reapportionment. All those things came crashing together in the early 1960s, and that was an era then of marked change, trying to catch up with the requirements of the time in those days.
There's been a lot of talk, and I think that you're bringing up reapportionment and the malapportionment that was there just by the nature of the beast prior to that was such a massive shift that it really was very disruptive of the whole, I think, comfort level of the people of the state about, well, how does this system work? And that was, we've had quite a few people discussing that throughout the series, and that was a big deal. And it eventually, of course, it skewed particularly the Senate toward urban representation more than the rural representation it used to be. Yeah. There
was a lot of feeling at that time that states' rights were being submerged. There was a lot of feeling that a question: does the legislature still fulfill its obligation as it was originally designed and thought of? All these things became into the picture. And we really are talking about two things today. One is the chronology of the sales tax in Montana from 1960 through 1971 and beyond there. And then the second thing is to focus on those years in which the sales tax was dominant and in which there were incredible things going on.
It first popped up about 1960, didn't it? But not in a big way. But was that Governor Nutter, or
yes.
what was it?
Yeah, Governor Nutter was talking about the sales tax, although a bill was not introduced in the legislature at that time. But Nutter was the first one, I think, that significantly rattled the sword of the sales tax and its need for the state of Montana. It was his feeling that we needed a tripod of taxation in Montana. Property tax, which was being highly criticized at that time because it was quite extensive. Income tax, same way. And then the third leg of the three-legged stool or tripod was the sales tax. And of course, a lot of talk about we're missing the income from out-of-state tourists, things of that kind. But that was Don Nutter talking. But it took about 7 years before the sales tax as such was submitted and voted on for the first time in those years of Montana's.
You know, just for context for our viewers, Governor Nutter was elected in 1960. He was the third consecutive elected term for Republicans, because Governor Aronson was in 52 and 56, and then Governor Nutter. He passed away in an airplane crash.
That's right.
And his lieutenant governor, Tim Babcock, who coincidentally was of the same party, because back in those days you didn't have to be in the same party, but became governor. And then Governor Babcock was reelected in 64, and that was a fourth consecutive term of Republicans. And fourth consecutive term. And it was in his second term that it kind of came to fruition. I mean, it really started to gel. But what it seemed to me that in my research, it was a lot of it, as differentiated from today, was about adequacy of the money to be able to spend on public services.
And that's what drove the sales tax, the feeling that you could accomplish several things. One is if property tax was too high, if income tax was quite high, you couldn't load more on them. But what you could do is adopt a sales tax, which was dominant in almost every state at the time. I think there were only 3 or 4 without it. And then you could have a new flow of tax revenues that were needed. There was some estimate that at that time that about the time that Governor Babcock suggested to the legislature that they consider the sales tax, that there was about a foreseeable need of about $50 million more increase in revenues to take care of the needs of the state of Montana, and that the sales tax was the most equitable way, provided that there were some reductions in the other taxes, that you exempt certain things, and in that circumstance, the devil was in the details, because a lot of people that allegedly were for the sales tax and organizations began to drift away when the farmers and ranchers wanted everything excused from taxation. That was one bunch you lost, and teachers and so on.
Isn't that the classic, though? I think this is a wonderful tax, except not for me.
Yeah.
You kind of run into that,
Well,
that on a lot of things, don't you?
And when you say a lot of things, it reminds me of the letter I got one time from a lady writing on Warm Springs, and said that she had a relative visited him over there, and she said it was terrible that when one got sick, all got sick. There wasn't enough room, enough treatment. And she said, I hope you'll do something about this as Speaker. And then she said, but don't raise any taxes on me.
Yeah.
Same kind of situation.
Yeah. So, but after Governor Babcock assumed the governorship when Governor Nutter had the plane wreck, and then ran for re-election in '64 against Roland Rennie, and won, and it was on his own as governor for the first time. That was '64 election. It took 2 years later, when they'd kind of seen this $50 million shortfall, that you were majority leader in the House in '67, and Jim Felt was Speaker.
That's correct.
And then Felt was the primary sponsor of what was the governor's bill for a 3% sales tax.
And that was probably the simplest the sales tax issue ever got, because it just went down.
Yeah.
That was the end of it. And
that was, I found interesting, the bill was House Bill 333. I wonder if they maybe kind of reserved that number for it a little bit.
To make sure it got the limelight.
Yeah.
Well, then
but you guys passed it out of the House,
yes,
mostly on party line.
That's right. And Senate went down.
That was a big battle in the Senate. Mm-hmm. I mean, what I meant was that it was straight party line in the Senate, mm-hmm. and they became the firewall against the sales tax, essentially. And the hero of that was Gene Mahoney. He was the majority leader, and so those who didn't like the sales tax kind of deified Mahoney.
Who later ran for governor but was defeated by Forrest Anderson.
That's right, in a close race, mm-hmm. Because in '68, I mean, the story of the sales tax is interesting because it is an ongoing story that in '67 it came up. You guys passed it out, overwhelmingly, mostly party line. You lost a couple people. I think you lost Ed Smith, and you lost to Gary Marbut, and
Perry.
Lou Perry, yeah. And one other, I think, or two others, in fact. I think you lost, well, it's not all that. Oh, Tom Haynes and Ken Wolf voted
That's
against
right.
it. That's right. Haynes was with the Retail Association, so he probably was thinking, we don't want to have to collect it.
Yeah.
Right? And I didn't know Ken Wolf, but those you had, but for those five, it went through with a party line vote. But the Democrats stood firm straight down the line, and it died a quick death in the Senate. Those were the days, by the way, when the whole legislature was 60 calendar days, right?
I've got a note here about talking about
Why don't you do that?
stopping the clock.
I'd love to hear that because
We were in session allegedly for 60 days for quite a while.
that was required by the Constitution. It said 60 calendar days.
60 calendar days. And it never proved enough. And so when somebody prior to our time developed the technique of on the 60th day, if you weren't through with the business of the legislature, you stopped the clock at midnight. So you're always on the 60th day by stopping the clock, even though you might be there another 15, 20 days. And finally, under the threat of suit by some taxpayers and so on, that it was an artifice. And if you're going to have an extra session beyond that, that you change it. And of course, later on, the legislature was increased to 90 days. But there's still these times they could not get all the business accomplished.
Now, the word I got of that was that at 11:59 they stopped the clock, and then it stayed the 60th day. And somebody told me that they sometimes put a shroud over the clock then. Was that symbolic? But in the 60 calendar days was a problem.
Absolutely.
And there certainly wasn't enough time. And under the old Constitution, it became very relevant in 1971 when you had extraordinary sessions, what we now call a special session. What we now call a special session had to be called by the governor. Right now, the legislature can call it, under the new Constitution, the legislature can call itself back in, but back then, only the governor could call them, right?
That's right.
And they could only deal with the subject he delineated, which was a very powerful thing, which is different than today. One of the things why I think we don't have so many special sessions in the last decade or so is that governors got very wary about once the legislature came into special session, they could take up anything they wanted. Mm-hmm. And that was like, oh, God,
Well, interesting because in 67, a big fight then in the legislature over the sales tax. And then you hit 60 after it was stymied and not passed. Then you hit 68 where nothing happened except in the background. There was still all the forces for and against the sales tax at work because they were pretty sure it was going to come into the picture again. And then you had 69 and then you had 91. Sales tax dominated almost everything.
Now, is it fair to say, if we take from where we were talking, the Senate Democrats killed it in 67, and Mahoney was the hero. He decided to run for governor, and in the Democratic primary, he came in second closely to Forrest Anderson, who was Attorney General. Mahoney didn't have to prove his bona fides on the sales tax. He'd obviously done it in the legislature. Forrest had to kind of prove, here's where I am on the sales tax for the constituency of the Democratic Party, which was anti-sales tax. And he came up with that pay more what for slogan, and his opponent was Tim Babcock. And in spite of the fact that he was an incumbent governor, he lost by 14 percentage points. to that "Pay More What For" slogan, that seemed to hit legislators who said in the '69 session, maybe this is a fight we don't want to have right now. We just had it in November. Is that kind of how it played out, do you think?
Yeah, without much doubt. Forrest Anderson's campaign was clever. Democrat Party was able to come up with some great slogans, and "Pay More What For" is one sample of them. And it was the position of the governor after the defeat in 1969 that that the people who really were in favor of the sales tax really never got out there and understood it and got to vote, and that they had to sort of shape the tax and see what could be done in the future, even though he had lost the governorship. And so that the feeling again was that the sales tax was the fairer tax with other exemptions from taxation and credits and things of that kind. For example, one of the bills that was drafted exempted pharmaceutical and medical things. One exempt farm machinery and equipment and so on. And trying to redesign and reach those groups that should have been traditionally for the sales tax.
Trying to move there's a little inherent regressivity in the sales tax without exemptions. So the idea of taking a little of the regressivity out of it and getting more people from, say, the middle class to be for it was kind of making it a little more fair and so on.
Well, and the other thing was a surprising thing, and that is that in most or a great majority of other states which had enacted the sales tax, the moving parties were the labor unions and the teachers' associations. And strange, because part of the great demand for funds at that time was to pay the teachers, provide proper education and so on. And here the parties that traditionally had been for it in other states were not for it in Montana. And that was the theory then, that they just didn't do the job in getting to the right people in the right way, and so that set the stage for the big 1971.
You know, it just goes to show you, about the time you think you got things sorted out, all of us, there's a wrinkle in it. And here it is. The wrinkle in Montana is just, the labor unions were against the sales tax, and it wasn't the case in a lot of other states. It really colored it considerably. Now, Forrest Anderson, when he first came in '69, you were Speaker. That was an important session, because in that session they set the stage for the Constitution, and they set the stage for the 20-department thing. Now,
government reorganization.
We take a second with that for a second, because that's where I first came into work in state government in 1969 in August with Governor Anderson's commission on reorganization, which you helped create. And in fact, we had your former assistant or deputy, Tom Harrison, on one of our programs. He's the last remaining member of that commission, and we had a program on reorganization. But it was pretty clear that the government was broken and needed to get modernized. Can you take a second, this is separate from the sales tax, but just kind of reflective on the attitude people had about maybe we ought to make this thing work?
Well, yes, and there was also the hope that turned out unfulfilled, that by going along with the idea of condensing state government, making it more efficient, that was one of the key things that Forrest Anderson was talking about, and that perhaps in adopting something that was needed and gave him some kind of kudo, that he'd come along and recognize that the sales tax had the same kind of merit to it. But he was cagey and tough. And he made a pronouncement rather shortly thereafter that said that if I'm in my terms of governorship, I will not vote for sales tax without a vote of the people.
Right. I will veto anything that doesn't have a vote.
That's
people.
right.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of the way that all fit together. But that was one of the very important things to the state of Montana, not as important as the sales tax, and certainly not with the exposure and attention of the sales tax, but still reorganizing state government. There was also a committee appointed from the Legislative Council to study the taxation laws of all provisions of Montana at the time. And when they got through, they came up with the fact that about half of them were probably okay, lukewarm endorsement, and that there were a few of them that could be revised, and the rest of them ought to be killed. And that floated around for a while and made some headway in being considered.
Well, when we look at this period of change, the key element of change was a strengthening or reorganization of the executive branch, the modernization of the legislature and staffing up the legislature was another big step in that period with the Legislative Council, which started in the late 50s, but it worked its way through and started to have staff, and that modernization of the legislature was a big thing to have it balance out with the executive.
And the modernization of the Constitution. That was another big issue at the time, and of course ultimately ended up with the Constitution, adopting of a new Constitution being in 1971, and that was by referendum. That's another whole story.
Oh yeah, that is quite a story.
Yeah, you know that handling of those things in the sales tax and talking about labor. Labor was strong, of course, against the sales tax, and Butte, all 8 of its delegates were strong against the sales tax. And if you can envisage the chamber of the House, at the front one end sits the Speaker's rostrum on the great Russell painting, and then the lobbyists arrange themselves up in the balconies, and at the upper left side, almost directly over where the Butte delegation sat, was labor's representatives. The ones I remember most were Joe Crosswhite and Jim Murray and Ernie Post, and Umber. And they sat up there, and
they looked right down on that Butte delegation.
And the Butte delegation looked right up at them for direction. And one day we were hung up on something, I forget what it was, we're taking a final vote. And there was either the guys up above from the labor union didn't get their act quite together, or the Healy and the other Butte delegation didn't get there, but they were having trouble getting the signals. And so I finally said, there'd be a moment recess. Would you 4 gentlemen up there, and I named them, stand up and signal a little clearer down to your Butte delegation so they know how to vote. And with that comment, the whole balcony erupted in clapping, and because it was such an obvious kind of line of direction at that time. But that was interesting aside.
You got to have a sense of humor in this stuff too, don't you?
Yes, you do.
Sometimes that's what keeps you going, in the midst of all this stuff. Now, I want to have you take a second and reflect on something about the sales tax that is different from today in terms of, because the Republican Party was so strongly for the sales tax, but they, unlike today when it seems like you don't see anyone in the Republican Party advocating additional money for spending for good things, one of the reasons you guys were for the sales tax was you thought more money was needed for governmental services. And a bit of a difference from today, where there seems to be a kind of almost an anti-government approach. I don't believe I remember that being so dominant in your period of time.
No, I think what's happened in the follow-up of things is that that vote on the sales tax referendum in 1971 was so strong. What was it, something like
70%.
70 to 30?
Yeah, 69.8.
Yeah. That's pretty much a lesson. And the Republicans were tired of getting beaten around and outmaneuvered. There was a lot of legislative maneuvering. You had to be on top of Mason's rules, which were adopted by the legislature, because there was so many motions and counter motion to lay something on the table, motion to set it down for a future date, just one after the other. And I think what happened is that the lesson, which I think was overkill, but it was a lesson. The lesson was that, hey, the people in Montana are not going to vote for a sales tax, and for one reason or another. And so you saw the fire go out of that, although I personally still think that the wisdom of a sales tax was good and should have been modified and then codified and become part of the Montana setup, because we've had problems after problems on revenue, except for a couple of times in the last several years.
Now, we're going to start talking about 1971, but before we do, and I want to see if we can show you a couple pictures here close up. You're correct, however, that on this thing, if you read those journals, the motions and the maneuvering in the journals is pretty phenomenal. I mean, you are correct. There was a lot. You had to really know the rules, because I'm reading those journals now, and I say, man, that is a convoluted path that bill was going on. It went over here and over there and up and down and so on. You know, in 1971, you were speaker for the second time, and I wanted to hold up this. I don't know if we can zoom in on it at all and see that. Let me see. There we go. That's Jim in 1971. Yep. Back it up a little bit because it's losing focus, but there we go. And next to him is Tom Harrison, who was a majority leader.
That's right.
And we had Tom on our executive reorganization show. And so that's the Speaker of the House, and as I say, a giant in politics of that period. And I wanted to bring this up as well, because this is a editorial page of the Montana Standard, the day before the sales tax election in 1971, and you can see that picture right here, which is Speaker Lucas, and there's this wet behind the ears kid here who's arguing the other side of the case there by the name of Evan Barrett. And all I can remember is I couldn't figure out what in the heck am I doing in this fight. I had been named executive director of the party in June of 1971, leaving the governor's office, and I was 25 when they selected me, and I soon became 26, little knowing that by the end of that month, you were going to put that referendum on the ballot. And then suddenly, I was thrust into this battle over a sales tax, and wow, what did I know? Except it was my job to get in there and go fight for it.
Sure.
So this was symbolic of the fact that I got such a kick the other day when we found that I'd forgotten that you and I were on the editorial page against each other 44 years ago.
Oh, gosh. Well, you see, you recall that much quicker than I did, but until you showed me the copy.
Yeah.
It was very interesting.
And your arguments were very salient, I got to tell you. You gave a good argument in there.
The final paragraph is sort of interesting on what I wrote. It said, the issue is not the imposition of a sales tax. It is the adoption of a tax return which will make possible of financing government for the state of Montana.
Yeah.
Whole thing sort of there.
Yeah.
But there's no question about it that the wind went out of the sails of the sales tax proponents.
And it not only took the wind out of the sails of the proponents of the sales tax, but a result like that, with the parties so diametrically opposed and identified, is it really virtually deep six the Republican Party from any chance of majority status for at least a decade. I mean, it was quite a long time before we had the Republican Party get in the majority of either house.
That's right.
It's an interesting thing, but the '71 session was quite a Donnybrook. The sales tax came up. You were implementing reorganization legislation at that point, but that was there was a lot of work in that, but that was not a heavy political fight because it had to be done by the Constitution. But the sales tax was there, and you went through this, remarkably, 3 sessions in the first 6 months, 2 special sessions and a regular session. What's your general recollection of that year? I mean,
well, let me look at my notes here because in talking about the consideration of the sales tax in that year, I put in that it was a wild year, a magical moment, great parliamentary maneuvering, harsh feelings sometimes, and strange alliances. Now, strange alliance referred in part to a continuing feeling between the Butte delegation and our own delegation, meaning our own by Eastern Montana. We sort of worked together on a lot of things that we considered necessary for our respective parts of the state. And of course, Butte is always the heart of things, and was the home of Anaconda Company as it started to diminish its effect there. And it was just a time that was unbelievable. And certainly the parliamentary maneuvering was something that you got to take a blackboard and start marking out to get the large number of motions that were made. For example, a motion to lay a bill on the table, which was usually designed to kill it. In order for it to come off the table and be reconsidered, the vote had to be 2/3.
2/3 at that point, yeah.
You just couldn't do that unless you had a specific purpose, and the Democrat Party did a great job in maneuvering under the parliamentary.
As I look in and one of the things that I ran into repeatedly was that if they really wanted to kill a bill, that as soon as the vote was over, within 24 hours you could move for reconsideration if you were on the prevailing side. So if I look at the Senate record, immediately Luke McCune would jump up and say, I move for reconsideration, and then his majority leader would jump up and say, I move that the reconsideration motion be put on the table. And then when it got on the table, it took 2/3 to get it off, and it effectively killed the bill. And it was almost like clockwork watching that stuff going on, there.
Yeah.
And you really did have to know the rules.
Yeah, it was great.
Now, in the regular session, the Democrats introduced a referendum bill, which was quickly killed. And then the Republicans introduced, I think it was House Bill 522 that Christensen and Fosburn and those guys put in, was to put it on the ballot in November of '72.
That's right.
But that died quickly and was followed quickly by the Republican version, which was House Bill 586. That did look like it was going to pass. And it made a committee report made it out, but you had 55 Republicans, and 3 of them broke ranks.
Yeah, that bill was, as soon as it came out, was referred to the Ways and Means Committee. And of course the minority report was killed. The majority report is the one where
and it passed, so then the bill was on second reading.
That's right, and they waived the rules to get it up there to third reading.
Right.
And then the do not pass recommendation of the committee report was adopted, which its main result was it killed
When it went you did go to third, and when it got to third, it was a tie.
And the governor had to step, the lieutenant governor was the...
Well, that was in the Senate side. In the House side, it just died.
Oh, that's right.
Because you lost the three of the other guys from 2 years before. You lost Perry and Marbut and Smith, right?
Right.
And so you went from 55 to 52, and the Democrats went from 49 up to 52, and you had a tie vote, and that was the end of it. As I read it, and it never even got over to the Senate then, in the main session.
Yeah.
In the main session.
That's right.
And
that was the end of it.
So Forrest called an immediate special session 4 days later.
That's right.
Did he consult with you guys, and was there kind of discussions among leadership to do, like, figuring, well, let's come back in here, or...
well, I'll tell you, Forrest was a different kind of chief executive. You didn't do much conniving back and forth. Forrest's way of handling the matter was to say, you will do such and such. And, a lot of criticism didn't bother him, rolled off his back like water off a duck.
Yeah.
And he moved forward. There was the real negotiation of where to go and what to do came in the later committee works.
Right.
There with people like DeZevi, quite active, and others, but Forrest was not the most cooperative chief executive.
Well, you, when they called you back in, and the sales tax was one of the two issues, I think the other was long-range building, but you have two issues, and that special session, which that went 27 days.
That's right.
27 days, the entire month of March, right up into the early part of April, in an effort. And again, there was, in that case, the big bill was House Bill 16 and House Bill 40. When I was looking through this thing, the 16 went from the House into the Senate. Again, you passed it on a third reading, 54 to 50, and the only guy to break ranks then was Perry. So when you finally passed it, and it went to the Senate, but they just killed it on a party line vote. So then you brought up this House Bill 40, and that's all the way in 22nd legislative day by the time that came in. So you'd been there already 3 weeks.
And that bill was the one that's sponsored by Murphy in the House,
right.
Republican, and some other, I think there were 5 other Republicans sponsoring that and bringing that out to the front.
Let me ask you about your leadership style. Were you, as Speaker, and you had the majority, and you had your team, how did you decide moving things forward? Did you have a core team that you worked with, or how did
pretty much. There were a lot of good, knowledgeable people on the Republican side in that legislature, and we formed sort of a cadre of those people and worked with them. Most of the decisions were mine, but they were mine, well fortified by my cohorts.
Your leadership style was to get them in the room and bring them along, and then generally you had an idea of where you wanted to go, and
that's right.
Got them to go there. Well, that's leadership.
Well, it worked out pretty well anyway.
You know, I told you before that you were formidable, and you were a frightening thing to Democrats who looked at you and said, now there's a guy, if he was running for governor, he'd be one heck of a candidate, and he'd be really tough to beat. Now, the sales tax made a difference in that, but I got to tell you, the level of respect that the Democrats had for you as an opponent was extraordinarily high. extraordinarily.
Well, that's a nice thing to hear.
They probably didn't say it that day.
No, no, but I had great feeling for Montana, and great feeling for the legislature and what it could and should be doing. And in that process, we made a lot of friends on both sides of the aisle. And so it was sort of a wonderful time to be working, even if things didn't go our way.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Well, in this House Bill 40, you passed that out, and you only lost Perry, and so you sent it across. And again, they very quickly disposed of it. I think the only Republican that broke ranks was McCallum, the new Senator McCallum.
Well, and I think he broke ranks more to have the right to reconsider.
That was another little gambit people would do, is if you thought a bill was going to lose, you could vote with the prevailing side, so you might be able to get a reconsideration motion.
Get another shot at it.
Yeah. But that died quickly, and all of a sudden, 27th day was on the table, 2/3 vote needed. Everyone went home.
That's exactly right.
And sat around for 2 months. 2 months till the next special session. Was there a lot of dialogue amongst folks in that 2 months, or was it
quite a bit of dialogue? Not the dialogue between committees that would be established and would be working on it, but involving many of the same people. And there was an effort to see if anything would come up. But every phone call ended up in the conclusion, hey, this is an impasse.
Well, you know, you were having an impasse between the Democrats and Republicans, and you had the governor taking the position that he would not support anything that didn't have a vote of the people. There'd been previous efforts to have it put on the ballot in November of '72, but that was too late to meet the needs of the state.
That's right.
So when the governor called you back in early June, we're getting awful close to the beginning of the fiscal year and about to run out of money. Action had to be taken. It took 19 days, but the first bill, again, House Bill 12, the one that became law, became the referendum, called for November of '72 as the election, but then it was shifted to November of '71 or September of '71.
September of '71. There was the feeling there that you just couldn't pile that onto the vote on the establishment of the Constitution. You had to have separate consideration, more time, and it should be earlier in the fall than November.
But was the consideration when we did move it forward to happen in November, concurrent with the CON, was that more of a fiscal issue that it costs money to run elections, so let's piggyback them, because it eventually became?
Well, that was a consideration, but I'm not sure that was the moving consideration. Just felt it was more time for people, however it went, to be working on things before the ample time before the Constitution, because much of what the legislature would do would have some influence on the Constitutional Convention when it came along in '72.
Now, what emerged and the consensus came, and once the consensus came, the votes started falling into place, was to have this thing on the ballot and to have it be a choice between a 2% sales tax and a 2% sales tax with a 10% income tax surcharge, or a 40% income tax surcharge. So it was a clear choice between two sources of revenue, which I don't think we can do under the Constitution today, under the rules, but under that Constitution we could. So it was a really clear choice put forward, and once that happened, boy, the votes really came, didn't they? I mean,
it did.
Yeah, you kind of have to get out of the way when the votes are there. You know, it's like the dam bursts and the water comes.
Yeah, especially when you take into consideration the frustration of a lot of people, a lot of voters in Montana, a lot of legislators themselves. You're in your third session for that year. The original first extraordinary session, and then the second. That's three times the legislature was meeting on those issues.
Now, here we are at the end of June. It's virtually July 1st. Something's on the ballot the 1st of November, effectively. There's a 4-month period, and suddenly there has to be a campaign. And from what I could see, that the pro-sales tax advocates, of which you were one, and a major one, grabbed hold of a shell group called the SOS, Save Our State, which had been left over from a previous election, and used that name and used that entity. And your clerk of the House, Zach Stevens, became the director of that, and there was a fellow named Nybo who was the president. But that became the vehicle that promoted the sales tax.
That's right.
And you remained a major proponent, a spokesman. You were out there giving speeches. You were giving knowledgeable speeches. I was pretending to give some knowledgeable speeches.
Well, I would take issue with that. But that's precisely what happened. And as the thing played out, it was designed to give more time on the sales tax result. In fact, there was a contingency in there, I can't remember just exactly where it came in, but if the sales tax passed, then the surtax surtax on income tax would go down, so it wasn't just totally putting a new tax on the people.
So it was the same amount of money, basically, just divvied up different ways. But it seemed like, in living through it, and again, I was a young guy just learning the ropes and living through it, while we were out talking the issue, the politics in the newspapers played out almost differently. The focus seemed to be who's supporting it, and there seemed to be a big consternation about is big business supporting the sales tax or not, and that became a very dominant headline-grabbing thing.
Well, to the point that within a few days prior to the actual election on it, an issue was thrown in the court of Judge Fall,
Victor Fall in
Helena, and it was to rely on a provision in the Constitution that could force one side to reveal its fund sources and votes, and so the group
Cost
got into court, got an order from the judge. Mr. Nybo, who had the books and information, was gone on a hunting trip. This was all played out not over 5 months of time, but more like 5 days.
Yeah. Pretty intriguing stuff. That suddenly there's a lawsuit, and he's hunting. It doesn't show up in court, and that makes the judge really mad. And he
sets it again, and he still doesn't show in the court.
And the net effect of it was, I almost have never seen something like that. But there was a newspaper story that started with the words, oh where has Ken Nybo gone? Oh where can he be? He's off hunting with the books that Cost wants to see, or something like that. Now,
I remember that.
Gosh almighty, when you read that, it's like, So it seemed to me the issue of what the sales tax meant was argued out by the participants like you very thoroughly, and like me, and like Jim Murray at the FLCO, or Clyde Jarvis, and the head of the Chamber of Commerce. We're all arguing the policy, but the politics was playing out in the headlines. Who's supporting it, and how much money, and
trying to dig not at the necessity of was it good, was it bad, but what were the currents flowing behind it.
Yeah.
was really what's involved. You mentioned Clyde Jarvis. I have to quickly tell you one instant. Clyde Jarvis was, when I mentioned that some of the movement in the House battle on sales tax was harsh. Clyde Jarvis, who had a radio program at 8 in the morning.
Featuring the facts, he called it.
Featuring the facts.
Sponsored by the
for
Farmers
the
Union.
Farmers Union. And most of the time it was spent on lambasting me. But the thing is, I could count on the phone ringing in my office about 8:10, and my wife would be on the phone, and she said, "Did you hear what he said today? What are you going to do about it?" So he got under somebody's skin.
Isn't it the truth that when you're in the political arena yourself, you have defenses and offenses. You can protect yourself, you can fight it out the next day, but the spouses have no defense.
That's right.
And it hits them, and they're saying, "Do something about this," and it's
family definitely is aware of these things that go on of that type.
Yeah, I've often found that they hurt a little more than the protagonists do.
Yeah, no question about it. You're not there to make a response to and from, and well, that was.
But because of this, suddenly, both the policy, I'm sure, and the politics were playing out wrong. The vote was 70% against it.
Yeah,
and it was a killer.
That's right.
And one of the things it did, and I want to focus a little bit on this, and this is personal, but you were the logical candidate for governor in 1972, and a scary, formidable candidate for governor, but that sales tax made a difference with you on whether or not you pursued that or not. And you opted not to.
That's correct. It took a lot of soul searching to reach that conclusion. I'd already set up a number of committees around the state in preparation of running for the governorship. And after that happened in that fashion so thoroughly, my wife and I and our family sat down at home, and you had to ask yourself, well, let's supposing you go through the battle and you win, and you're there. What does that do with your family, which at that time happened to be my wife and myself and children? And we finally decided that life had a little more to hold for us in backing away. And it was a hard decision to make, believe me. And it just went that way. We were in the battle for the special session at the time. I mean, for the annual session. And I was of the opinion that the annual session would be voted on and would be sustained. And if you're going to stay in, you're in just deeper.
You'd be going every year to the legislature.
And affects your law practice, affects your family, all those things. And so...
Well, we're running out of time. This hour has gone by so fast, I can't tell you, and it's been such a great pleasure. I wanted to say that you stepped out after one more term in the legislature, but your presence was missed in all kinds of ways. And the leadership that you provided for this state was extraordinary leadership. Even those who disagreed with the direction you might want to go had the highest degree of respect for everything you brought to the table. And I got to tell you that it's been a great pleasure for you to be able to join us in the Crucible of Change and give us your reflection on this marvelous time. And so with that, I'm going to have to close quickly and let you know that we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode.